You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Falguni Kothari.
Thanks for tuning into Author Stories, the podcast where we bring you the story behind the stories and the storyteller. Author interviews, writing advice, book reviews, all sorts of great stuff. If you are a book lover, Author Stories is the place for you. We have more than 550 author interviews in our archives at hankgarner.com. Please go over there and check it out. Also, check out our YouTube channel, where we also have all of the episodes archived there. If you don't find an author interview that you're looking for on the website, click on the Archives tab. There's a long list of them where you can click and download and listen right there. I'd like to tell you about some sponsors that make the show possible. Pico's House. The Pico's House website now has a new look. Visit Crystal Pico Watanabe and her team of 8 people who help her provide services to fiction authors. Crystal's full slate of services now include beta reading, manuscript critique, developmental editing, line editing, copy editing, and proofreading. Authors, you can also inquire about putting your books in her new Book Lovers box, which is a monthly digital subscription box with a different theme each month. This is free for authors for a limited time. PicosHouse.com, that's PIKKOSHOUSE.com, for all your book publishing needs. Devin Ford, Recon, the Expansion Series Book 1. Hundreds of years in Earth's future sees the United Global Territories striving to colonize the Moon and Mars. The discovery of a clean energy source ended the world's reliance on fossil fuels overnight, and years after the resulting wars, a new discovery puts the tenuous world peace at risk. That of faster-than-light travel. With humanity on the verge of traveling to new solar systems and all the humanitarian and scientific possibilities involved, a discovery by the reconnaissance team turns everything upside down. Join the small team of the reconnaissance mission who fight friend and foe to complete their mission objectives, no matter where it leads them or what the personal cost. Devin Ford, Recon, the Expansion Series, Book 1. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Falguni Kothari on the show with me today. She has a fantastic new book called The Object of Your Affections, and I find her and her work extremely fascinating for more than one reason, and we're going to get into all of it here in just a little bit. Welcome to the show, Falguni.
Thank you so much, Hank. It's a pleasure being here.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure having you. We've got lots of great stuff to talk about, but before we do, we begin each show with the same question. And that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, well, funny thing is, I don't think I've ever wanted to be a writer. I sort of stumbled into it accidentally. So I guess I was good at writing all through my school and, my childhood. I've always been a storyteller. I've told stories in different mediums. Like I'm a dancer, and in Indian classical dancing, you generally tell a story through your dance. So stories have been kind of ingrained in my, the way I was raised, or, the way my mind works. Also that I'm an only child, so I lived in my head a lot. So I had all of these, I would make up stuff, correct? Like as a child does, or especially when you're by yourself so much, you're either reading or you're watching something or you're making up stuff in your head. So I was good at that. And I guess I was good at writing, although I didn't like it. I hated the structured nature of writing,
right,
especially because I grew up in Bombay. I grew up in Mumbai, and our school system is very structured. So I hated that it was so dry and I couldn't just, write about dragons, and I couldn't write what I wanted to. And so I never really thought that I'd be a writer. I never really went in that direction because it just seemed so fantastic to me that people would put out all of these 200, 300, 400 page novels and they would make sense and there was a structure to it. And I was like, oh my God, how do you do that? Then about 10 years ago, I've also always mostly worked from home or been a homemaker. And about 10 years ago, both of my children had, I think, reached the stage. They were either in middle school or just about to go into high school. And they'd reached the stage where they really didn't need me except for, maybe dropping and picking them up for after school activities. And then my mother, who's a busybody, like she cannot sit still for even half a second. Okay. She's like, you know what? Your children are grown now. You just cannot sit on your butt all day long. You have to do something. And I'm like, like, what can I do that I can stay home and do it? Because I think that pretty much my whole life I've gravitated towards that. It's like I've either just danced semi-professionally or I've been a jewelry designer in one of my really, really previous lives. And so I was like, let me see if I can, maybe go back to school. And then I started looking at actually online courses to do, online classes to do, which was short and just to get me in the frame of mind of going back to school. And I stumbled across this course called Romance Writing Secrets. And I took it. It was like a short 6-week course, but something just snapped. And I was like, oh my God, this is so much fun because I'm making up stuff. I'm writing all these stories. I'm making up these characters that, what I couldn't do in school. Let me do it now. And then I think about in 11 months, I had my first novel, which I didn't even know that I'd finished writing it. And I just threw it at my book club and I was like, you know what? This is what I've been working on. Do you think it's any good? And they were like, oh my God, you need to send it to somebody because yes, it's good. And that's sort of how I just accidentally became a writer. And it was picked up. That first manuscript was picked up in India by an Indian publisher.
That is fantastic. I asked that question about wanting to be a writer or storyteller, and I do distinguish between the two, because I think you can be one without the other, or I think you can definitely be a storyteller and not be a writer.
Right.
Storytelling is in all manner of forms.
Right.
It can be in film. It can be in dance, like you said, or on the stage. There's so many, different forms of the way we communicate with each other. And I love it that you make the connection between storytelling and dance. Because I'll ask people sometimes, how do you feel like that connects to your storytelling gene? That thing inside you that wants to tell stories. And you say that in traditional Indian dance, it's very, it's very commonplace. That's something that you actually do think about, that you are telling a story with your dance. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. So
Yeah.
what I did, the dance that I'm trained in, it's called Kathak. Kathak, which not literally, but sort of translates into, and then we tell a story.
Gotcha. So are these, what does that, for the dancer, you know that you are communicating this story, to people. Are there any types of preparation, that you go through? That dance can be very formal. It can be very, rigid, very structured. How much interpretation do you as the dancer have to embellish and to, do things to put your own flair on the story?
So this is a structured formal dance, especially Indian classical dance is very structured and formal. You have to put yourself through a rigorous training in that dance form, in that particular dance form, because there are very specific body movements, facial movements, hand movements that are very particular to each style of dancing. And And then once you know all of these myriad movements and expressions, that's when you put it together and start telling the story. So it could be about, the god Krishna, meeting his lover for the first time. So that's a story. Or it could be one, Shiva, one of the angry gods. He's slaying the demon or the beast, and, like how good triumphs over evil. So there are 1,000 ways that you can put all of those different movements that you've learned, that you've trained in together. But the training is rigorous. I mean, it takes years sometimes you can't just, say, like I want to tell this story in the Kathak format, and then, practice for say a month and do it. That doesn't happen. It usually takes years.
Right. The traditional stories from your culture have always fascinated me. There's such a rich history, and these the legends and the tales. How much did growing up in that culture and hearing those stories, how much did that affect you as a storyteller?
It completely affects you because you're steeped in it. You're steeped in the culture. You're steeped in your India. The way you grow up, your culture is so much a part of you. And also because India is so diverse in itself. Like every state has its own culture, its own language, its own food. And how you grow up, everything you do, everything you become is informed by that culture, by those certain sets of sort of, I'm saying, a way of life that you lead. And I think I've always not just myself that I was in my head so much and, making up stories, but it was also everything that we learned. Like everything was a story. The way it was taught to us was a story, especially in my house, like with my grandmother. When I grew up, we lived in a joint family. So my grandparents lived with us. And I remember every single morning before I went to school, she would tell me a story. And the story would either have a moral at the end of it, or it would be about some particular god or some aspect of our culture that she thought I needed to know, but she'd present it in the format of a story. So it sticks in your head, right? The story will stick in your head, and then eventually the moral or the objective of the story will also stick in your head, because it's such a fun, lovely way to get your point across. And I think this is what I've shown even in The Object of Your Affections. One of the characters, Naira, she speaks about this, that her grandmother telling her stories, and through those stories, she comes to know who she is, what her culture is, how she wants to be as a person.
And that's not a uniquely Indian thing, that we connect with stories like that. I think that's a human thing.
It's a human thing, yeah.
I love that your culture puts such importance on that, because sometimes in the West we don't put as great a importance on the storytelling aspect, because that's who we are as people. We live through story, and I really wish we could take more of that from your native culture.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. You don't live there anymore, though, do you? Do you live in the States now?
I live in the States. I live in New York. We moved here when my children were very little. I think I've been living here now close to 19 years. Almost 20 years. Yeah, almost 20 years. Yeah.
So when you started writing, you were here.
I was here. Yes, absolutely.
Gotcha. You said that you reached out to a publisher in Mumbai, and they published your first book.
Yes.
Gotcha. How did you go about, querying and all of that to get a hold of, that publisher? And were they, was it written, in English? Was it written in Hindi? What was the reason that you chose that publisher?
So I write all my stories in English. I don't think, I mean, I know how to speak Hindi and Marathi and Gujarati, which are three of the languages that I know from India. But I think writing in that language is going to be impossible for me. I can speak it well, but I don't think I can write and read anymore with any kind of fluency or even any kind of speed. So yeah, that boat has sailed. So why I went about it this way is, so as I said, that I just stumbled onto this whole writing, avatar of mine. And without thinking, I had that manuscript, and really without any kind of investigation into the publishing industry or into things of how do you get published, I went looking for a publisher. Of course, very quickly you're kind of updated on how things are done. And in the US, you need an agent first, and then and at that point, like 10 years ago, I mostly write about India or Indian characters or the Indian diaspora. Like most of my books will be deeply set within the Indian culture. So at that 10 years ago, there were very, very few opportunities for my kind of writing in US publishing. And I very quickly learned that, over here, you need to go through an agent, and you need to go through, or you have all of these steps before you can even hope to get published. It isn't that, oh my God, I wrote a book, let me just call up someone, throw my manuscript at them, and they'll be like, oh my God, we'll be so pleased to publish you. It doesn't work like that. However, in India, it kind of worked like that 10 years ago. It's no longer the case now. It's pretty much the way it's done in the US, even in India now. You have to go through an agent and et cetera, et cetera. But 10 years ago, it was easier to query directly to the acquiring editor of a publishing house. And you also have all of the major 5 book publishing houses in India with their Indian branches. So I queried a bunch of them. I think within a month, I had, that's Rupa Publications, which is the #1 Indian publisher of fiction right now. They immediately said yes. However, because I didn't know or understand anything about the industry, I kind of gave the whole book away for nothing. And I think I even gave away both my children to them. But yeah, so you learn, with every mistake. But it was easy in the sense that they picked it up very fast, but I don't think I made a good decision then. But anyway, it was picked up, it was published, so I was happy.
Well, and the thing is, a lot of people don't get a great deal with their first book, but there is something about kind of this energy building that once you have that first one published, the second one tends to be a lot easier. And
it does.
And yeah. So what kinds of stories were you telling? Like this idea that you had that became the first book. I know you come from this rich storytelling, tradition, but what were the kinds of stories that were coming out of you?
So my first 2 books are romance, pure and fun romantic fiction, which is just, 2 people meeting. Doesn't matter whether they're in Mumbai or whether they're in London. And I kind of sort of label them NRI fiction. NRI is a term that you use for non-resident Indians, basically expat Indians. And my stories kind of revolved around them. And, just the boy meets girl and they fall in love. And where did they meet? They met online. And the other one, I have a friends to lovers kind of situation. So that was a fun and, I'm not going to say not challenging, because again, both of these first books, I was still learning my craft. I'm still learning my craft. but they were easier in the sense that I knew where the story would start and I knew where it would end. And I knew, the themes would be light and fun and about love. After those two, I kind of jumped genres and I started writing a fantasy novel, which is based in Indian mythology. And if you know anything about Indian mythology, it's as deep and wide and vast as the Roman and the Greek mythologies. We have a similar structure in our pantheon, in our gods, and in which which god represents what planet or what kind of power, or so we have a lot of that also.
I would say it's even richer in a lot of cases.
Yes. So my third book that I wrote was it's called Soul Warrior. So it is about that. So I took the legends of India and I kind of brought them into a modern setting. So we have all of these gods wearing jeans, using phones, and kind of, wondering like what the hell has happened on earth. And, we've been away in heaven and now what are we going to do with all these people? So it's kind of that. So I jumped genres in that. So again, I sort of reinvented my writing skills, my readership. And then after that, I came into my women's fiction themes, which the first one that I wrote, My Last Love Story, I thought I was writing a romance, but apparently it was not.
I love when a story just takes its own turn and you're just along for the ride.
Yeah, because I pitched it as a romance to my editor and she was like, no, honey, this is not a romance. And this was in the US. See, by the time I got to my fourth book, by the time I got to pitching My Last Love Story, I'd been writing for about 4 or 5 years. I'd made contacts here. I'd been meeting people. So, to get a one-on-one meeting was easier because I was going to conferences and everything. So I pitched My Last Love Story to Harlequin US. And my editor is like, honey, this is not a romance. And, I love the story, but it doesn't fit Harlequin right now because Harlequin at that point was only publishing pure romance with a happy ending. And mine doesn't really have, it's a happy-ish ending. I think it depends on your point of view, how you see it. But anyway, it wasn't a romance. So I decided to self-publish that. And I did. And within a month of me self-publishing that, the editor that I pitched to, she emails back. And she's like, I know you just took the book out, but do you think you want to take it off the self-publishing platform and re-pitch it to us? Because Harlequin was launching a few women's fiction imprints, and she thought this book would do wonderfully within those imprints. And so that's how I got my US publishing contract or deal.
Nice. There's, Harlequin has gone through some major changes in the last couple of years. I remember as a kid, my grandmother, reading the traditional Harlequin books and, they all look similar and, everybody knows what I'm talking about when you talk about the Harlequin romances. But that house is doing such broad work now. They're publishing all kinds of stories, and I'm happy to see that for sure. But
stories are changing because they have to change.
Yes.
They have to reflect what's going on in the world right now.
Yeah, because we're changing.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I also love that you, go back and forth. You've got, traditional boy meets girl stories. You've got, complicated romances. And then you also have these fantastic kind of urban fantasies built around the, the rich, legends and things. Do you ever feel conflicted, that, I need to write this kind of book, but I'm really passionate right now because I want to go tell this legendary tale. How do you balance those out in your desire to do one or the other?
So far, I've always written the story I want to tell at that moment.
Yeah.
That's why I keep
That's
jumping.
Important, isn't it?
That's why I keep jumping genres, because I don't really write with something in mind. I'm just writing the story that's in my head right then. It may not work so much for me from, going forward, because I do now have certain obligations to, certain contracts and certain publishers. So we'll see how it goes. But I can see in the last 10 years or after 5 books that I am gravitating more towards women's fiction. And yes, of course, fantasy, but the romance kind of has gotten weighed down. I mean, I love writing a romantic story. I mean, I think that's my ultimate in pleasure, is just, bringing 2 people together and just seeing them happy. So even in my women's fiction, there'll always be a romantic thread, but I see that I'm writing more and more themes, weightier themes and sort of heavier themes.
Sure. And you've got to go where that passion is, because I think readers can tell when you're writing something just to kind of check off the boxes, or as opposed to writing the story that's kind of burning in you to tell. Right.
Yes. And it's also more fun, because then there's no effort. It just comes out because it's burning to come out.
Yeah. You said earlier that in the beginning you hated writing because of the rigidness of it and the structure to it. It just kind of felt stifling, I guess. But when something happened and you flipped a switch, so to speak, and the words just flowed. Can you put your finger on what it was that changed for you, that opened the faucet for the words?
I think it was, so the structure that came in school was that you only have to write 500 words. Like if you're writing about a fire station or a fireman, it has to be, the way I used to write essays, or the way they were required of us in school and in college, in India, was, that you give information about about the thing that you're writing about the, the theme that you're writing about. You give information about it, and then you not necessarily give your own thoughts about it, because that wasn't sort of encouraged over there. You give the truth about it, the universal truth about it, which I found restricting, because I wanted to give my own opinion. That you may think of firemen in a certain way, or a fire station in a certain way, but I think of them in another way altogether. And especially with, with historical events, I wanted that kind of a discourse or a discussion or a debate, which wasn't really allowed there. It had to be the way it was presented in your textbook. And I found that very limiting. Whereas if you're writing for yourself, if you're creating a story, I can tell the same stories, maybe about history, which is another genre that I'd love to try out, and I'm thinking of trying out. But you can tell that story from your own point of view, and also keep it faithful to the characters. I mean, you're going to build those characters that you want to build, so that you can tell the story that's been in your head. I think, I don't know if that makes sense to you, but it was kind of freeing to be allowed to express my own opinions out on paper, as opposed to, just following the textbook.
And I think there's so many people listening right now, and they're shaking their head like, yes, I understand that. I have felt the same thing. And it's one of those weird things where the education part of it is so important, because we do need to learn, how to effectively communicate. But then we have to take the shackles off and say, okay, now you know the rules. Now go do with it what you want to do.
Right.
Yeah. I think a lot of people have that same sentiment.
Yeah. So there's this really, Alexander McQueen, the designer. Right. He said this amazing thing once, which I absolutely incorporate in all of my stories. He's like, you need to know how it's done for you to be able to dissect it into the pieces and, just take what you want out of it. But you need to know the format first. You need to understand how to write in a particular way, what a genre does, or what the story should be about. And then you can put in your own opinion. But unless you know the basis, unless you know the heart of it, you're not going to get it.
Right. Exactly. Well, let's talk about your new book now. It's, when people are hearing this, it's be out everywhere. And we encourage everybody to get their own copy. It's called The Object of Your Affections. And in typical, Falguni style, it is, not your typical, relationship book. Tell us where this idea came from and kind of what unfolds for us as readers.
So The Object of Your Affections is about two best friends, two women, who are kind of navigating modern relationships and, life's hard choices, since it's a women's fiction novel. Loosely, the story is about Paris Fraser, who's a workaholic with kind of a tragic past. And she's sort of, very regimented and very focused on just herself and what she needs to get out of life. And on the other hand, she's married to this wonderful man who's sort of compromised a lot of things for her sake. And it's just struck her that, what? If I love him, then I need to, kind of relent on certain rules that I have, or certain things that I didn't want to do. I need to relent on that, or I'm going to lose him eventually. So she kind of thinks up this perfect solution to starting the family that he's always wanted, but she's not. By asking her widowed best friend, who's recently moved to New York, to be their gestational surrogate. And not only that, I think by the end of the book, she's more that, it's not just about the surrogacy. It's about, parenting itself, the weight that we put on motherhood as opposed to fatherhood, and why is it like that? So
right. Well, was there a well, let me ask you this: when a story comes to you, when you first start thinking about how a story is going to come together, what comes to you first? Is it a character? Is it a setting? Is it maybe a news article? There's a lot of talk about surrogacy now, and this is gaining more attention. Does that kick off a story? What usually brings the idea alive for you?
It's usually the characters. A character comes to me first. A character in his or her setting, or maybe going through an issue. Why I chose this particular story or this particular subject of surrogacy. A lot of things I think happen simultaneously, because I can't really pinpoint that one thing that made me choose this subject. I have a couple of friends who've gone through surrogacy and IVF. So that was kind of fresh in my head. Secondly, that the book that I wrote before this was about two men and a woman. So I kind of wanted to mirror that by writing about two women and a man. And I didn't want to write about a love triangle or, two men fighting over a man. I didn't want to do that. And then the surrogacy thing was in my head. And then I think I read not an article, but it was, I guess it was an article in a magazine. It was in a movie magazine about how, movie stars are more and more movie stars, even in India, they're choosing to have their children via surrogacy for various reasons. What particularly interested me was that there's this one actor who's single. He's still a bachelor, because he hasn't found, the one yet. And he's like, you know what? I'm ready. I'm 40 years old. I don't think I may not ever find the one, but I'm ready to be a father now. I'm completely invested in it. So why not? So he had his children through surrogacy. And I was like, oh my God, what is that?
Right.
Because you generally attribute these biological clock or these, inner feelings of I need to be a parent more to, you attribute them more to females rather than males. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And I was like, I need to write about this. I need to write about the the man wanting to be a father more than the woman does. And why is it a stigma if the woman doesn't want to have a child?
Right. And you're really challenging those kind of stereotypical roles, like you mentioned earlier, that we don't put as much weight on men really desiring family. We think of the woman as the driver for that. And I really like how you're kind of turning the spotlight and showing families as truer representations of families.
Thank you. I'm trying to do that. Yeah.
Your character of Naira, and am I pronouncing that right?
Naira.
I'm sorry. Yeah, Naira, is also an expat. Are you drawing from your personal experiences when kind of, painting her and helping us to, get a better understanding of what her experience is like?
Always, because the whole expat experience is kind of, it's challenging. I didn't want to move. I didn't consciously go about, because why she comes to New York and why I came to New York, of course, are completely different reasons. But the feelings, or the pattern that she follows is kind of similar. Of settling in, of wondering whether this is going to work or not. Like, frankly, I did not want to move to this country. I was very, very happy in, where I was, in Mumbai, and I loved having my family around me. And over here, I knew it was going to be a challenge because you have to be a nuclear family. You have to take a lot of responsibility yourself. Whereas in India, there's just so many people who help you out in various ways. Like, I never had to worry about babysitting. There was always someone around to take care of the children if you wanted to go out. Whereas here, you have to plan everything. You have to have everything on a schedule. You have to plan. You have to make sure there's a babysitter when you want to go out, and you have to make sure everything, is done in a specific way. It took me, I think, 5 years to sort of, be happy. Not really even be happy, just to settle down in this country. And I think that kind of is what I'm trying to show with Naira, that you need people. You cannot do it alone. If you just decide to move somewhere, if you've come at a time in your life where you're not going to college, like if you move here and you're going to college, you already have that built-in community or that village to take care of you. You're immersed in your work. But if you've come just out of the blue, not really thinking about it, not really wanting to come, but circumstances make you come, then you have a difficult time settling down. And I think that is what I hope that I've brought across, at least with her, of why she clings to her friends so much, is because she's just lost.
Well, and it's so strange that you could tell us that experience and, about being separated from your larger family and your support system and really needing to cling to the people directly in your life. And on some level, we get that. But when you put that in story form and you make a character that we really care about and you show from all of these different angles what's really going on, that, again, we talk about learning from story, like we, began talking about it. It all kind of comes full circle, doesn't it?
Right. Of course it does. And that is how, you see the other, like that, I'm pretty sure there'll be plenty of people who read this book who still live in the same town, maybe even the same house that they were raised in, that they've never moved anywhere. So for them, it's kind of eye-opening. Oh my God, like she moved continents, and this is what someone goes through. So
Right.
it's lovely to put yourself in someone else's shoes just for that little bit without actually really having to do it.
Right. Right. And you take us on such an incredible journey, in this book. And it is so broader and deeper than any, quote, relationship book. If we, we put labels on things, and it really, we try to distill things down to things we can, easily communicate to people. But this book really gets down, to friendship and what it means. How strong is friendship? How strong is our marital relationship? How strong and what can we go through, and how these different relationships in our life, ultimately affect us. What a beautiful, powerful book.
Thank you. I try to.
Well, the book, when people are hearing this, the book is available everywhere. The Object of Your Affections is the title. Falguni, if people are just learning about you, is there a place where they can find you online and maybe dig in all your past work and follow you into your next adventures?
You can absolutely find me. I think I'm across all kinds of social media. I'm most active on Instagram, and my Instagram handle is @author Falguni. And that's the same. My Twitter handle is the same thing, @author Falguni. I'm on Facebook as Falguni Kothari author, and my website, falgunikothari.com. So I think if you put my name in Falguni Kothari, I think a whole list of things will just come up.
Great. And I'll link them all in the show notes where people can easily find them. Falguni, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today. We're going to send everybody to see you and to pick up their copy of The Object of Your Affections. It was my pleasure to be here, and I love talking about it. And I love talking to you. Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to Author Stories. Find all the archives at hankgarner.com. Now, stay tuned for a special audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series.
On the Wednesday night before Thanksgiving, Joey locked the doors of the Washington Irving Chapel and checked the windows from the outside, making sure that the cemetery offices were dark. Satisfied, he donned a knit cap and trudged uphill to the employee parking lot. He'd forgotten how desolate the grounds became at night. A fog had gathered, blurring the moon and stars. His rusty Volkswagen Beetle, christened Ladybug by Jason, sat in shadow alongside his dad's white van, which bore an image of the horseman and the cemetery's web address. Joey swept a palmful of condensation from Ladybug's windshield and fumbled for his keys. He heard a laugh, high and young. He froze. "Hello?" He shook off goose flesh and found his key. He started the engine and backed out, headlights off, praying not to knock over a headstone, again. A child stood on the hillside amongst the graves. "You okay, kid? Cemetery's closed." He turned on his headlights. The child vanished. Joey idled in the drive, frowning. What had just happened? He turned off the headlights and waited for his eyes to adjust. The silhouette reappeared. The child stood in the road now, blocking his way. He and the ghost stared at each other. He bit his tongue and squinted over the steering wheel. He couldn't resolve the ghost's features, only a tiny body in ruffles? Yes, a dress. A little girl with shoulder-length hair. The figure crouched, threw its arms over its head and skipped away. A giggle followed after. The ghost skipped up the hill, turned around, and beckoned through the fog. "Please come." Joey shook his head. No way. Ain't gonna happen. But he felt compelled to follow. What could a little girl do to him after all? He would keep a safe distance. The gravel sounded like soft rain beneath his tires. It drew him helplessly, past weeping cypresses and mausoleums blue with moonlight. He followed the giggle, the skipping ribbons, the little body made of shadow and quicksilver. The north end of the cemetery grounds rose to a steep wooded slope. The ghost had led him to Section 77, the northernmost boundary of the cemetery, but he'd lost her. He killed the engine, summoned his courage, and climbed out. The night air brought him fully awake. "Where are you?" he whispered, scanning the graves. A row of diseased hemlock trees stood at the fence line. Joey knew them well. They were dying, infested by some parasite called, he fished for the name, woolly adelgig. His crew had cut them back many times, lopping off limbs and heads, trying to save them. The hemlocks had grown back twisted and tormented. They stood as a row of grotesque sentinels guarding the threshold of the forest. The ghost climbed the slope, spun at the fence, and sat hugging her knees. The black mass of the Rockefeller State Park Preserve loomed behind her. "What do you want?" Joey whispered. "Play." He stepped forward, hands shaking. He just wanted to see her face, the face of a real ghost. To see the curve of her cheek, the sparkle that might have been her left eye. "Come and play, Joey." He froze. The sound of his name terrified him. She pointed over his shoulder. "Play with us." He turned and realized his mistake. He'd driven with his eyes on the girl, trying not to lose her, never looking behind. They had been followed.